Well, this morning we enter a new series, which is like part 4 of the first series. But this is a series on the life of Joseph. I want to share with you some of my favourite movies. For no other reason than they're my favourite movies, and I wanted to share them with you. But if I wanted you to, it's all about taste, isn't it? But if I wanted a belly laugh, then I would watch the other guys. I don't tend to watch movies more than once. Once I get the story, I'm done. But this is a movie I can just keep watching all the time. For some reason, it just tickles my fancy, and it's really good. So if I wanted you to have a belly laugh, I'd say maybe watch Will Ferrell and the other guys. If I wanted you to have a feel-good experience, I'd say try this movie called Lady in the Water by M. Night Shyamalan. Sci-fi, gentle horror. It's not a horror movie, but there's just a little gentle horror in there. But anyway, it's a feel-good movie about community, in fact. If I wanted you to have a feel-good experience, I'd probably recommend that story to you. If you wanted to have some drama and adventure and a little bit of political intrigue, then I'd recommend The Dark Knight. I think it's probably the best superhero movie ever made by quite a lot. Daylight second. But we're in church. We're not in your living room. So I want to recommend a story to you that will be good for your soul. And that story is the story of Joseph. And as we read the story of Joseph, it's the longest story unit in the Old Testament. This is going to be this is a story for the ages. It's a story that you're probably familiar with, even if you don't know the Bible all that well, because the West End made a musical about it. Andrew Lloyd Webber, right? He made a musical about it, and it's in popular culture. And it's a very well-known story, a story for the ages. But when we get into it, you'll find out that it's a story for the soul. And I want to give you this morning an overview of the Joseph story and bring you up to speed with where we are in the book of Genesis, because we're starting in Genesis 37. And so we've had 36 chapters already. So I need to bring you up to speed in case you haven't been here before. So I want to give you this morning 3 appropriate responses to the Joseph story. Okay. And again, I'm not looking for you to have a belly laugh. I'm not looking for you to feel good, nor am I looking for you to have a sense of a thrill and adventure. But I want your souls to be stirred and your faith to be encouraged. And so that's why we are looking at the Joseph story. So number 1, the first appropriate response to the Joseph story is to be informed. So be informed. The Joseph story is going to help us understand the plan of God for the ages, and even where we fit in that plan. But not just the macro plan of God, it's what is God doing in the ages, but also how does God work in individual lives, and what should our expectation be to some degree of the life of a believer. So be informed. The Joseph story closes out the book of Genesis. So here I want to do a little bit of review. And here's a little book chart of the book of Genesis, which you've seen before with the other sermon series, introductions. But the book of Genesis can be broken into 2 distinct parts. It's actually a more technical way to break up the book of Genesis, but in terms of being able to understand it, think of it in 2 distinct parts, chapters 1 to 11, and then chapters 12 to 50. So chapters 1 to 11 is the beginning of the human race. How did creation come about? How did humanity come about? And how did we come to be in different people groups all over the world? That's Genesis 1 to 11. Everything was created by God from nothing, chapters 1 and 2, and it was all very good. But then in chapter 3, mankind, we messed up, and so therefore we brought sin and decay and chaos into the created realm. And we brought death into the created realm. And then chapters 3 through 11 show the consequences of that death and how that death impacted society as people grew over all the earth. So in Genesis 1 to 11, you've got the problem, which is sin and separation characterizing humanity. And there are 4 major events recorded in those first 11 chapters. You've got the creation, you've got the fall of mankind, sin, the flood with Noah, and the kind of like a rebirth of the earth, and then the Tower of Babel, chapters 10 and 11, where we believe we get all the different people groups from. The second part of the book, chapters 12 to 50, and the longer part of the book, is about the beginning of the chosen race, the beginning of the people of Israel. So when you're approaching a book of the Bible, one of the first questions you need to try and ascertain is, who was it originally written to? So these books were written to an original audience for an original audience. And then God, through that, communicates to his people down through the ages. And so the book of Genesis was written by Moses, we believe, and it was written to that first generation of Israelites who came out of Egypt. So this book is written to a generation of Israelites who've been enculturated in Egypt for 400 years. And that generation would have a lot of questions, and the book of Genesis is answering a lot of the questions that those people have. And that's why the focus is on the people of Israel, the beginning of the chosen race. But why is it on that? Because this is the beginning of the solution. So chapters 1 to 11, the problem, mankind, sin enters the world. Chapters 12 to 50, God is going to raise up a man through whom he creates a nation to reach the nations that have been separated at the Tower of Babel. So it's reasonably simple in that sense. Tower of Babel, mankind separated into nations across the earth. Chapter 12, God raises up Abraham through whom he creates a nation to be a missionary nation to reach all the other nations. That's the solution. And so in 12 to 50, you've got 4 main figures. They're called the patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. They're the patriarchs. So that's how the book works. Those 4 patriarchs, the 4 main figures, well, there's 2 of them that loom larger than the other 2. So Abram is the father of the faith. He's the father of the Hebrew people. He's the one God chooses, and he's the one that God gives the Abrahamic covenant to, the ultimate covenant where he says that he's going to use Abraham to be a blessing to the whole world. Whoever blesses you, I will bless. Whoever curses you, I will curse. You'll have many descendants and you'll have the land. And much of Genesis 12 to 25 is about Abraham. And then from 25 to 49, you really have the Jacob story. So even though we're in the Joseph story, Joseph is a son of Jacob. And you'll find at the end of the Joseph story, Jacob comes back into it. And in chapter 49, he actually gives a blessing to all of his sons. So they're the 2 big figures in the book of Genesis. Isaac, unfortunately, is a bit of a transitional figure. We pass over him pretty quickly. But Joseph, there's a fair degree of information given to us about Joseph. But he's not one of the key patriarchs. But now, I mentioned before that the book of Genesis was answering questions that this first generation of Israelites had as they came out of Egypt. What questions did they have? Well, who's our God? Because we've been in Egypt for 400 years and they've got lots of gods. They've got lots of gods. So who's our God? And the book of Genesis answers that question. He's the creator God. He's a sustainer God. He's a God of holiness. He's a God of grace. He's a God of justice. Who are we? So as the Israelite people, as the Hebrew people, who are we? Well, we are God's chosen people, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And that's what the book of Genesis is teaching them, saying, hey, you guys, you're connected to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Understand who you are, because if you understand who you are, then you'll understand your purpose. Why are we here? We're not just another ethnic group. Ancient Israel was not just another ethnic group amongst many. It was God's chosen ethnic group to become a nation so that they would be missionaries to the rest of the world. They were going to be God's focal point through whom the world would be reached. That was their purpose, and the book of Genesis reiterates that purpose. That's why the covenants are so important in the book of Genesis. Moses is communicating to this generation coming out of Egypt, here is your purpose statement for life as a people. You're to be a blessing to the rest of the world. You're to have this land and you're to have many descendants. And then, of course, the book of Genesis also illustrates how this all works. And that's why faith is such a big part of the Abraham story. That's why the story about Jacob is from deceiver to believer. He comes to faith. It's all about faith. That's how it's going to work. By trusting God with all your heart, loving him with everything you've got. That's how it works. If you try to do it your own way, as Abraham found out with Sarah and Hagar, chapter 16, or as Jacob found out numerous times as he sought to do his own thing, things will turn out in a mess. If you do it your own way and you don't trust God's way, things will not turn out well. And so the book of Genesis also illustrates how it all is meant to work. And so it's going to emphasize faith. And you're going to see that particularly in the story of Joseph, where the way that Joseph responds to situations is the way that God wants the Israelites to respond to situations. The way that some of his brothers respond to situations is not how God wants the Israelites to respond to situations. So they're the questions that are being answered. And these are some of the answers. So the Joseph story connects the Israelites to the patriarchs and the promises. It very practically shows them how they ended up in Egypt. The very practical purpose for the Joseph story is to tell this generation that Moses has come to and is calling out of Egypt with the 10 plagues. He's saying, how do we get to, if we are Hebrews people who have been promised the land of Canaan, why are we in Egypt? What are we doing here? So the Joseph story connects the dots. So, well, here's how we came to be in Egypt. And then, of course, the book teaches how to live so as to please God. So the first appropriate response to this Joseph story is to be informed. Understand what the book is about, understand where the story lies, and what the story is doing. The second appropriate response to the Joseph story is to be inspired, because the Joseph story parallels the Jesus story in some ways. I need to add that. The main point of the Joseph story is not to prefigure Christ. Let me be very clear about that. Even those who really love typology don't go so far as to say the main point of the Joseph story is to prefigure Christ. It's just that Christian commentators right from the beginning have seen all these different parallels between the life of Joseph and the life of Jesus. But the New Testament itself never draws out any of these parallels. So they're just observations that we've made, just connections that we've made, and I think they're legitimate. What are some of these connections? These are just some of the connections, but they're pretty cool. And Joseph is going to be called the beloved son. He's going to be the favorite son of his father. Well, of course, Jesus is the only son of his father, but he's also the beloved son. He's called the beloved son. Joseph, chapter 37, is going to be rejected by his brothers. Jesus, of course, John chapter 1, verse 11, came to his own and his own received him not. He got rejected by the very people he was the king of. He came as the king of the Jews, and the Jews rejected him as their king. So there's a parallel. Joseph is going to get sold for 20 pieces of silver. Interesting. Jesus gets sold for 30 pieces of silver. Suffered unjustly. So Joseph suffers at the hands of his brothers unjustly. He suffers at the hands of the Egyptians unjustly. And of course, we know that Jesus also suffered unjustly. But then Joseph will be exalted after being humiliated. So he's going to spend time in the dungeons of Pharaoh, but then he's going to be elevated to a position of honor. And of course, the same is true of Jesus. With his incarnation, that's his humiliation, and then his death on the cross, Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 to 11. Then ultimately, Jesus ascends to heaven. He's exalted at the right hand of the Father, and he's coming back one day and will be exalted all over this earth. So you've got that similarity as well. And then, of course, both of them are a means of salvation for many. Joseph says this in chapter 50 when he's talking to his brothers. He says, you meant it for harm, but God meant it for good, so that many might be saved. And, of course, we know that Jesus means of salvation for all who believe in him. So the deliberate and a lot of parallels. Some commentators go a little bit crazy with this, as you can expect down through the years. So some will even suggest you've got when Joseph is in prison Who is he in prison with? Well, he's cupbearer and a baker. How about that? And the cupbearer, wine, and the baker, bread. Hold on a minute. We've got the bread and the wine of the communion table right there in the Joseph story. Well, Christian thinkers have been very imaginative down through the years. So just because somebody can see something doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So, yeah. But anyway, there are definitely parallels between the life of Joseph and the life of Jesus, and that's quite inspiring, and you'll see those as we go through. So be informed, be inspired, and then thirdly, third proper response to the Joseph story is to be in awe, because the Joseph story, like most of them, is a fantastic work of literary art. It's a fantastic work of literary art. I like to think of it as the fingerprints of the Holy Spirit's inspiration of Scripture. But when I'm talking about literary art, I'm talking about the way that the stories are put together, the parallelism, and the structure of the stories are such that you sit back and you go, wow, that's amazing. And not all agree on this parallelism, because again, you've got Christian thinkers who are using their imagination, but I think there's legitimacy to these outlines. Now, just a warning, this is overload, okay? So I'm not expecting you to read this next slide, because there's too much information on there. But all I want you to see is that there's a parallel structure to the book of Joseph. It's a long story, so you can expect the parallelism to be quite long. If you want a more detailed copy of this, just go to the website. PowerPoints are on the website. Just download them, and they're on your phone or you're on your computer. Okay, but I understand there's too much information, Wendy, on this PowerPoint. I just want to let you know, because she'll tell me off, right? Okay, so this is the Joseph story. This is how it's structured in parallelism. So you can see on my left, it begins with Joseph having a dream of his brothers bowing down to him. And then in chapter 50, what happens? His brothers come and they bow down to him. When Joseph's brothers get rid of Joseph, they tell their father that he's dead. And so Jacob mourns him in Hebron. Well, at the end of the book, you're going to have mourning near Hebron, but this time it's going to be Joseph mourning the death of his father, Jacob. Okay, so that's your A's, and then your B's, and then you go all the way down. Right in the middle, you have the brothers coming to Egypt for food. And this is kind of like the center point as to what connects the patriarchs to Egypt. Joseph goes down to Egypt, then all the brothers come down to Egypt to get their food, and that's where Joseph is going to reveal himself to them. So the centerpiece of the story. So wonderful parallelism, but in addition to that, it seems that Moses, under the inspiration of the Spirit, also liked to have this parallel pattern. Things happen repeatedly in the book and the story of Joseph. So, for instance, you've got trouble between Joseph and his brothers at the start twice. In the first section, it says that the brothers hated Joseph, and then straight after that, it says that the brothers dealt with Joseph by throwing him down a well. After that, you have 2 episodes of sexual temptation. So Judah is going to be sexually tempted, and then Joseph is going to be sexually tempted. One's going to do it respond the right way, one's going to respond the wrong way. After that, you're going to have the interpretation of 2 dreams, twice. Joseph's going to interpret 2 dreams of the convicts, the baker and the cupbearer, and then he's going to interpret 2 dreams of Pharaoh, one after the other. And then the brothers are going to come down to food twice, because the first time they come down, they don't bring the whole family, so the next time he's going to get them to bring the whole family. And then he's going to have his family brought to him. Then there's going to be this report of prospering in Egypt twice. The second one will be the blessing of Jacob over his sons. And then at the end, you've got the death of a patriarch twice. So Jacob's going to die, chapter 49, and then Joseph's going to die, chapter 50. So you've got this wonderful pattern. So Be in awe. I step back when I see this. I mean, I don't come up with this. I read this, and then I check it out and think, yeah, it doesn't work. And then I step back and go, wow, this is amazing. This is amazing work of literary art. And the idea behind it is to help those who are reading it, because often the scriptures would be read, to follow along in the story. So they didn't have chapter divisions like we have in our Bible, but they would be able to pick up parallels. So just like in many sermons, the preacher will start a sermon in one way, then he'll end it in a similar way, bookending the whole thing. So it's a rhetorical device as well as a literary device. Okay. Key themes of the Joseph story. Well, I've kind of summed them up in the title of the series. Sovereignty, sin, suffering, and salvation. I think they're the key themes of this story. So God's sovereignty / providence. Sovereignty and providence, I think, are very similar. They're certainly very connected. So the book of Joseph is going to give us insight into how God works in human history and how God works in our own life. And just because there's a downturn in our life at any particular point doesn't mean that God is angry with us. It could do, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. It doesn't mean that things are off track. It just means God is wanting for us to trust him and to wait. And you see this in the Joseph story where he goes through great trials for long periods of time before he sees any light at the end of the tunnel. And in fact, there are times in the Joseph story where there's no reason for him to expect any light to ever come. But the way we read the story is that he doesn't lose his faith. He hangs in there. And this is how God works sovereignly. This is how he works in providence. He allows things to happen and he brings things to bear in order to test us, in order to grow our faith, in order to help us to become more and more like Christ. But in the end, God is working all things to his will, and he's working all things out the way that he wants it to go. So the key verse of the Joseph story is over in chapter 50, verse 20. You might want to turn there with me. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, well-known verse, which is why it's the key verse. At the end of the book, the brothers, after Jacob has died, the other brothers are really scared that Joseph is now going to turn on them because Dad's gone, and Joseph really loved Dad, and Dad really loved Joseph. And because Joseph loved Dad, he was kind to the brothers, but now that Dad's not there, will he still be kind to us? And so they're afraid, and they come to him, and they try to placate him. And Joseph says, don't worry, guys, it's all good. And he says in verse 20 of chapter 50, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So at the end of his life, or after his many trials, Joseph was able to look back on all the bad stuff that had happened to him and was done to him and say, well, your intent was bad, but God has used that in such a way that it's worked out really good. But you don't get Joseph when he's stuck down the dungeon in the well, at least it's not recorded, you don't get him thinking or saying, God, what have you done? Why are you doing this to me? How does this all work? What the picture you get is one of faithfulness in spite of suffering. So this is a wonderful, the key verses really ties into this whole idea of sovereignty, sin, suffering, and salvation. All four themes are mentioned in that verse. God providentially and sovereignly working things out. The sin, obviously the brothers, their intent was to harm Joseph. And so you've got a whole bunch of sin in this story. So this story is not dry. It's not academic. This story is very human. It has all kinds of human frailties and sin in it. And we are encouraged and exhorted through this story to deal well with sin. And then you've got suffering, particularly from Joseph. Joseph suffers throughout this story. And again, we are encouraged and exhorted as we look at this story. This is how you suffer. Expect it, and this is how you do it. And God will give you the grace to do it well. And then, of course, you've got salvation, the ultimate end. So you've got Joseph exalted to a place of prominence whereby he can save not just his family and bring them down to Egypt where they'll become a great nation, or a great people anyway, before they become a great nation, but he saves many other people in the world as well. because of his astute administration. And of course, he also saves the relationship between himself and his brothers. So what you've got, and maybe this is even more significant given it's written to that generation coming out of Egypt, is you've got at the end of the Joseph story a reconciliation between the brothers. Obviously there was bad blood at the start because they tried to kill him. And now he's in a position where he could do the same to them. He doesn't. And there's reconciliation. And that's salvation too. That's a healing. That's a coming together. So wonderful themes in the book of Joseph that we will explore in greater depth as we go along. And key verse, chapter 50, verse 20. Okay. So big idea. What would I like you to take away from this introductory overview message? Well, allow the Joseph story to inspire your walk with God. So going back to the opening, I don't want you to have a belly laugh. I mean, do that on your own time. I don't want you to have a feel-good experience. I mean, I want you to feel as good as you can. I mean, I want you to prosper before God. But in terms of warm and fluffies, and I don't want you to feel intrigued about adventure and drama. But I want your soul to be enriched and encouraged and your faith to grow. And that's what we will experience if we allow God to work through us as we go through the Joseph story. That will be our encouragement. Alrighty. Well, thank you for being with us this morning.